Welcome to part 2 of Spinoza's biography and the deep dive into his arguments and the repercussions that ensued from his TTP. I will not go into the details of Spinoza's biblical deconstructions as it would be too long and probably boring for many. You'll either have to read the TTP for yourself or buy my book Dangerous Ideas when it's finally ready to see the full breakdown of his arguments. What I do need to explain is what Spinoza meant by true religion, which is the philosophical love of God and loving kindness for our fellow humans that form the core of Spinoza's ethic and are the only two principles of true religion. Spinoza derived these concepts from Van den Enden, his mentor, and tied true religion to the core ministry of Jesus as expressly written in the book of Matthew. In this regard, Spinoza writes, "For as I've said, Christ was sent not to preserve the state and to institute laws, but to teach the one universal law." Spinoza challenges the idea of incorporeal spirits that had arisen in Judeo-Christian beliefs primarily because such beliefs were used in conjunction with threats of eternal punishment. Spinoza's assertion that souls die with the body was one of the reasons he was excommunicated in 1656 by the Jewish community. By 1660, he had codified his thoughts on the topic in his short treatise on God, man, and his well-being, where he writes the soul was simply our conscious mind, which perishes with the body. In this regard, he and Hobbes are in agreement against the clerics who believe the soul is corporeal and eternal, for without them, how else can religion scare people into submission with threats of eternal torture in hell? Here, Spinoza echoes Hippo of Samos, who denied the existence of a soul, while Democritus and Epicurus questioned if it would survive death, which it could not, as both Hippo and Spinoza associate the soul with the mind, which dies with the body. In Spinoza's case for Judaism, he could further point to the fact that scriptural support for either the existence of immortality of the soul is both questionable and sparse. In one of those inexplicable and enigmatic moments in Spinoza's thought processes that leave people scratching their heads, unless you've read all his stuff, letters, ethics, short treatise, etc., when the whole picture materializes, as what he says in the 7 universal dogmas of the TTP is completely at odds with everything else he writes. It is the 7 universal dogmas that Hyman was addressing in the citation at the start of Part 1. While Spinoza does not state what he thinks about souls in the TTP, he does make a very ambiguous and contradictory allusion to the Judeo-Christian understanding of them in Chapter 14. By this point, Spinoza has completed most of his textual criticism and begun to conclude his theological arguments by stating that private faith is different from, and not a threat to, public worship of a state church. In the 7 universal dogmas, God is not only concerned with obedience, but is actively judging and forgiving those who repent. The personal, judging God Spinoza alluded to here is entirely inconsistent with the rest of his thinking. It not only contradicts his established primary conception of an impersonal divinity, but also stands at odds with the rest of his philosophy regarding souls and salvation by mimicking curiously Christian doctrines. Scholars speculate that this section may be a concession to more liberal-minded Christians in an attempt to find common ground and provide a basis for the unphilosophical common people who needed some form of structured belief system in order to practice justice and loving kindness. Regarding souls and salvation, Spinoza wrote the short treatise, though unpublished, a decade before the TTP was released, and he had obviously already begun crystallizing his thoughts on the soul and consciousness by the time of his excommunication in 1656. Why he did not, or deliberately chose not to, relate what he truly thought about souls here is puzzling, aside from the speculation that he was seeking common ground with Christians. A case could be made that in the 7 universal dogmas, he was simply using terminology to which his audience could relate, though choosing to frame it through the traditional views on eternal souls subject to judgment came nowhere near to presenting his conceptualizations accurately. Considering Spinoza's lack of belief in an immortal soul, what, then, was therefore this detached and impersonal God to judge? This question is especially relevant as Spinoza ridiculed the use of afterlife punishments as a control tactic of the clerics, which the free mind does not fear. Hyman asserts that the 7 universal dogmas are meant to be understood dialectically, propositions that contain truth in some respects but not all, especially the anthropomorphic connotation inherent in God's judgment. Thus, by understanding what Spinoza meant by the intellectual love of God and the joy and freedom this brings, then his definition of salvation becomes clearer as something very similar to the Buddhist concept of enlightenment. Becoming self-aware and learning to take control of our ever-changing emotions provides peace of mind, and in this manner a conscious awakening is equivalent to salvation. Spinoza derived this conception, as with his opinions on cosmology, from Epicurean philosophy. As noted in my first video on the historical links across time documented in Dangerous Ideas, Epicurus had been influenced by Pyrrho, who became a Buddhist in India while on campaign with Alexander. From Pyrrho through to Spinoza, there is a direct chain of philosophers and ideas who transmit this very Buddhist concept, which is manifest in Spinoza's ethic. Understanding leads to enlightenment, and enlightenment leads to nirvana. By chapter 15 of the TTP, Spinoza begins laying the groundwork for his political arguments for chapters 16 to 20. Those arguments being that the state has nothing to fear and that it is, in fact, more beneficial to the state to allow freedom of thought independent of religious interference. Spinoza advocates for a strict secular democracy, the intent of said republic being to create a state which allows true and unrestricted freedom of thought. In this regard, both Hobbes in Leviathan and Spinoza argue for the subjugation of religion to the state. For Hobbes, his intent is to stop the sectarian divisions which had racked England and the disruption of the English Civil War the country had just experienced. For Spinoza, it was to prevent the abuses of power by the clerics in stifling science and freedom of expression. According to social contract theory, anarchy reigns where an imposed system of order does not inhibit our baser human instincts. A strong, sovereign authority which enforces the rule of law domestically and protects the citizenry from foreign aggressors is the ideal champion for maintaining this social contract. Of course, this contract is only valid for as long as the sovereign, whether monarch or republic, can provide security and stability. The people are released from their obedience to this contract if a sovereign authority cannot protect the people from being pillaged by foreign invaders or is incapable of punishing wrongdoers in their own country. Both Hobbes and Spinoza make this point. Spinoza and Hobbes both argue that as this situation has been established, the people owe their allegiance to the state, and the state can make any laws it sees fit for the benefit of order and stability. In the idealized state proposed by both men, those laws extend beyond the political realm and specifically include the control of religion. Their arguments are most definitely not about separation of church and state, but are specifically about the subjugation of the church to the needs of the state. And as part of the social contract, the citizens are expected to toe the party line on the declared state religion. Spinoza uses chapter 17 to argue from the authority of the Bible in favor of the subjugation of religious authority to the state, citing multiple references from the Old Testament where the priesthood was not independent. Spinoza's argument on this point are not relevant, as they only served to provide him with outdated biblical ammunition aimed at re-subjugating the clerics to civilian authority. What is relevant about this part of Spinoza's argument is that he is drawing a direct parallel to the politicking of the Calvinist clerics of his age and the chaos that the Jewish priesthood caused following their release from the Babylonian exile by the Persians. Citing, "After they acquired their freedom, the high priests took for themselves the right to rule, by which they obtained absolute control. This created among the priests an intense desire to rule and to attain the high priesthood." By thoroughly documenting the litany of abuses perpetrated by clerics across the millennia, Spinoza makes his case for the subjugation of the church to the state. Clerics are not to be trusted with power or influence of any kind, as he clearly demonstrates with ample historical examples. As in the past, the religious authorities of his own day continue to wreak havoc in the Dutch Republic and upon the safety of his philosopher friends. In Chapter 20, the final chapter of the TTP, Spinoza outlines his case for unrestricted freedom of thought. This argument is the culmination of the entire treatise. He has spent 19 chapters laying out his argument just to be able to claim, as his chapter title states, "It is shown that in a free republic everyone is permitted to think what he wishes and to say what he thinks." Spinoza goes so far as to hypothesize that a secular democratic republic which allows freedom of thought would be peaceful and stable, something the modern secular countries demonstrate. In the opening paragraphs, he made the core of his argument, which has most impacted the development of secularism. Spinoza makes a powerful call for a free society, one that echoes across the ensuing centuries, arguing that unrestricted pursuit of knowledge is not a threat to the state, but makes society stronger and aids political stability. On the other hand, laws regulating thought control by authoritarian regimes stifle productivity and economic growth, while the populace chafes under the repression. Hobbes and Spinoza, not surprisingly, aroused much ire from establishment authority, who were threatened by their ideas from both the political and religious arenas. One of the most common criticisms for both was to accuse them of being atheists. The literal definition of an atheist being one who does not believe in a supernatural deity is used more appropriately today than in the past. Throughout history, the term atheist has often been hurled at any person, believer or not, who has a different opinion from that of the person who lobbed it. One Christian with a different idea is a heretic or an atheist to another Christian, although that person believes in the same God. To accuse a rival of atheism has often been used as more of a weaponized slur than a statement of the true beliefs of the person at whom it was directed. Spinoza, though he frequently referred to loving God, could correctly be classified as an atheist for his conception, which quite obviously diverged from the mainstream personal God of the Abrahamic faiths. Spinoza is most often labeled with the term pantheist, someone who equates, as Spinoza does, God with nature, which is closely related to the deism of the American founding fathers. Due to his identification of God with nature, it was also easy to see why he was branded an atheist. His protests at being referred to as an atheist seem to be hollow and insincere, considering the full understanding of his meanings scattered across his writings and correspondence. His denials of being an atheist were possibly meant to shield himself from prosecution, or perhaps he had actually convinced himself that his philosophical love of God did not amount to atheism, especially given his repeated ad hominem attacks on avowed atheists as immoral. The accusations of atheism directed at Spinoza were politically motivated from those committed Christians and Jews whose worldview and authority were most threatened by the inconvenient revelations of his textual criticism. When threatened, the human response is to go on the attack, and that is precisely what happened to Spinoza and his TTP. More serious than a few stinging words of rebuke were the official condemnations, which, though they were fragmented and sporadically enforced, came immediately. The Synod of South Holland appealed to local authorities for them to suppress and forbid the publication of the TTP. At the same time in Amsterdam, the Synod approved the request for having it banned. However, it was not until summer of 1674 that the TTP was officially banned after the High Court issued its decree. Exactly what Spinoza feared and wrote so forcefully against, the repression of intellectual freedom by clerical authorities, had been triggered by his own book. It was rather prescient when he wrote one of his most profound observations on secularism, which resonates across the centuries. That his thoughts and ideas were such a threat to the influence the clerics had over political and civil matters was evidenced by their panicked response to suppress his bold treatise. His religious contemporaries considered it to be the most dangerous book ever published, and as sectarian authority has since given way to secularism over the intervening centuries, they were correct to fear its impact on their waning influence. Finally, in 1679, Spinoza earned a spot on the Vatican's notorious Index of Prohibited Books, joining Hobbes and Descartes. Spinoza sparked the Radical Enlightenment, the anti-clericalism/monarchism that characterized the later revolutionary period and the calls for greater participation of the people in democracy. Spinoza was foundational to the liberal tradition of political philosophers who came after him, as his ideas were repeated by future Enlightenment writers, particularly the French, due to his powerful call for freedom of thought and speech. His democratic ideas and quest for intellectual freedom have echoed across the centuries, making the TTP one of the most influential works on the road to secularism. Beyond Spinoza's influence on the revolutionary thinkers in Europe and the United States, he also had a major impact on the Jewish Enlightenment that occurred in the following century. Some of the results of this Jewish intellectual transition included an integration of the more open-minded and oft segregated Jews into modern society, and the creation of secular Judaism, or as some refer to themselves in the current age, cultural Jews. If you like my content, please like and subscribe to get notified of new videos. Please also consider supporting my work by becoming a Patreon sponsor. You can also find me on the following platforms.